Well, folks, welcome back to the Frontier Western Heritage Channel. I'm Todd Kessner here in Bozeman, Montana. And today I want to do a video that summarizes the results of the pocket pistols that we've been testing for the last several weeks, really a couple of months actually. And I was thinking, you know, you could compare all these results if you went back and watched all the individual videos and jotted down the data. But I also thought, you know, who's going to do that? So I'm going to do that for us, particularly since it's below zero outside. We are in the middle of big game season here in Montana, so the time that I do spend outside, I'm spending pursuing wild game and all bundled up and not trying to fit percussion caps on little cones out in the cold and wind. So want to do an indoor video that would really bring together all the data that we witnessed as we did all these tests. So let's take a look at each of these pistols that we tested individually, and then I'll take the best load from each one, the best energy from each one, and we'll compare them all side by side, and we'll see really which one would be the best choice. And there's going to be some differences of opinion, I'm sure, but which one would be the best choice for your concealed carry gun if you were anywhere from 1860 through the 1880s. So let's take a look at this data side by side and have a summary from there. So for those of you who haven't been able to go back and watch all the videos, let's do a quick review of the pocket pistols that we tested through these trials. And the very first one was the Smith and Wesson number 1.5 single action in 32 Smith and Wesson, and that was produced from 1878 to 1892. Our second trial was conducted with Colt's new revolving pocket pistol, and something that we would know today as the Colt 1849 pocket pistol in 31 caliber, which was manufactured from 1850 to 1873. On our third trial, we jumped up to the 38s and picked up a Smith and Wesson model number 2 single action in 38 Smith and Wesson. And if you count from beginning with the Baby Russian in 1876 and going all the way through the third issue, which had a trigger guard, we span that time from 1876 all the way up to 1911. For our fourth trial, we loaded up the Colt model 1862 police revolver that many folks today would call the 1862 Pocket Police. And this gun was manufactured originally from 1861 to about 1873. For our fifth and final trial, just for fun, we picked up the Ivor Johnson Gun and Cycle Works 32 Smith and Wesson break top. It's a single action, double action. You can shoot it double action. You can also cock the hammer and fire it single action. And tested that just because it's from the smokeless era, the early smokeless era of the really early 32 Smith and Wesson smokeless cartridges. So we wanted to see how that smokeless cartridge would compare to the black powder era guns that we had shot previously. So let's take a look at our best performance that we had with our Smith and Wesson 1.5 single action. I loaded up 8 grains of GOEX 4F under a 90 grain bullet and came up with an average velocity of about 592 feet per second. In the end, that resulted in 70.2 foot-pounds of energy for the 32 Smith & Wesson Model 1.5. So let's move on to our second test, and it was the Colt 1849 pocket revolver. I put 15 grains of 3F powder under an 80 grain conical, and that resulted in the best energies that we had. With our 15 grains of 3F powder, our 80 grain conical, we got an average velocity of 714.9 feet per second, which ended up giving us an energy of 90.8 foot-pounds. So for our third trial, we jumped up to the Smith & Wesson number 2 single action in 38 Smith & Wesson, and we had 15 grains of 3F powder under a 150 grain bullet. This load jumped us up to 155 foot-pounds of energy. For our fourth trial, we went back to the percussion era and picked up the Colt 1862 police model, and is able to get 25 grains of 3F black powder under a 126 grain conical bullet. This load got me by far the best energy of all of the tests at 210 foot-pounds. Well, about the time I was wrapping this up, I ran across a box of old 32 Smith and Wesson loads from the very early 1900s, and I thought, you know what, kind of curious on what the difference was, if there's any difference between that black powder era and the smokeless era. So I pulled out the old Ivor Johnson double action pistol, and we tested some loads of 32 Smith and Wesson that were very early 1900s smokeless loads. So for our early smokeless version of the 32 Smith & Wesson cartridge, we had an 85 grain bullet over an unknown factory loaded powder, but it gave us an average velocity of 595 feet per second, which translated into an energy of 66.8 foot-pounds. So here we've got all of our trials here on the same page. We've got the Smith & Wesson 1.5 single action that came in with the best load that I found so far at 70.2 foot-pounds. And then we had the 1849 Colt pocket revolver at 90.8 foot-pounds, and very comparable calibers actually. And jumped up to our Smith & Wesson number 2 single action, and in a 38 Smith & Wesson, that gave us 155 foot-pounds. Our Colt 1862 police model, 210 foot-pounds. And then we went to the smokeless version of the 32 Smith & Wesson and came up with 66.8 foot-pounds of energy. So looking at this data, which one would you carry? Well, after looking at the data side by side, before I want to reveal the gun that I would carry if I were in the 1800s, something really popped out at me that should have known because of powder capacity. But when we compared these two firearms, this is the 49 pocket in 31 caliber, and this is the 32 Smith & Wesson. And really, this 32 Smith & Wesson is a the actual bore diameter is 321, so it's actually, or excuse me, 312, so it's actually really a 31 caliber, very, very comparable to the 49 pocket. But the energy and the velocity, and then results in energy, coming out of this 49 pocket is much greater than the 32 Smith & Wesson. And likewise, the 1862 police model, same thing, much more energy, much more velocity coming out of that than our 38 Smith & Wesson. And you know, thinking about that, as we made the transition, as historically firearms made the transition from our percussion guns to our cartridge guns, you would think that maybe they try to mimic that velocity and powder capacity in the modern case. And I understand why they wouldn't necessarily in the copper cases. There was a bulging issue. You know, too much of a load in the wrong gun made things very difficult to load and unload because they would bulge back, and you could have some case burst in the copper era. But once we transitioned to brass, you would think that, well, we need a little more powder charge in here to give us the same energy that we had back in the cap and ball era. But obviously they didn't do that. But it is interesting that our percussion guns did produce a lot more energy. Sometimes we call that knockdown power versus the cartridge guns that were supposedly more modern and in an advancement, really, in a lot of ways. So that was just an interesting thing. You certainly were not with a gun that was lacking power, for sure, when you were in the percussion era, and they actually outperform these early cartridge guns as well. But if I were to make a decision, being someone, let's just say it's the 1880s, and so all of these are available to me except for this little Ivor Johnson up front. But if all these were available to me, which gun would I carry? And as much as I love the power of the 1862 pocket or police revolver, you're basically shooting an 1851 Navy in a smaller package with 5 shots. I mean, it's got a powder capacity, you know, we were getting 25 grains in it without any problem, and in a conical bullet. So even though this is the strongest gun, and you could get it with a shorter barrel, but mind you, if you cut the barrel shorter, you also drop the velocity and therefore drop the energy as well. So even though this has got a little more punch to it, I would go with the 38 Smith & Wesson if I had all 4 of these to choose from, simply because we don't have a cap that can fall off. We don't have a cap jam that could potentially happen. This thing's got a 38 Smith & Wesson cartridge caliber and 5 shot, easy to open up, easy to dump those loads. easy to put 5 more in if I needed to reload, which would be nearly impossible under stress with the police model. And so I've got a gun here that I know that if I had to pull it out and protect my life, some silly thing's not going to go wrong, like the cap falling off or whatever could potentially happen. So I would go with this gun, even though it's a little less concealable than the 32. The energy difference was substantial, and so I can't conceal this 38 Smith & Wesson, this Smith & Wesson Model 2 single action as easy as a 32, but I get a whole lot more gun, and if I had to reload it, I could. And again, all I've got to do is pull it out and cock the hammer. I'm pretty assured that this thing is going to go off and hopefully prevent personal injury to myself from some aggressor. So I would go with the Smith & Wesson number 2 single action, even though it doesn't have the most power. One thing I was a little bit surprised by as well, when we did the 4F powder in this 32 Smith & Wesson, we got better energy than we did out of the 32 Smith & Wesson that was a smokeless load. And so I can kind of understand that too, because when the smokeless 32 Smith & Wesson cartridges were coming out, after the turn of the century particularly, there were still a lot of black powder guns being carried, guns from the black powder era being carried, and I'm sure they didn't want to overload the 32 smokeless and blow up all those guns that may have been purchased just 10 or 15 years previous. So I can kind of understand that, but boy, having that early 32 Smith & Wesson in a smokeless round did not do you any favors when it came necessarily to energy. You were better off shooting the old black powder load out of the 32 model 1.5 single action Smith & Wesson. So some interesting things here. I'm sure that many of you would have chosen potentially a different firearm. I'd love to hear from you. Hit that in the comment box and let me know and your rationale. It'd be kind of fun debate to have. So if you like the video, hit that thumbs up button, and also hit that subscribe button if you haven't subscribed yet, and we would really appreciate it. And you know, once again, even though it's below 0 outside and we're doing an indoor video, I sure have enjoyed it, and I just want to thank you for coming. Well folks, welcome back to the... Already did that part. A couple interesting things popped out. One was that I was surprised to see, I guess, I wasn't surprised. Gummit.